There are evenings when loneliness arrives so quietly that it is almost hard to notice at first. You can be surrounded by noise, by messages, by people moving past you in the street, and still feel as though something essential has gone missing. A room can be full and yet strangely empty. A life can look connected from the outside and still feel distant from within. And for a very long time, that was part of what made loneliness so difficult to understand. It did not leave behind a visible wound. It did not announce itself like a fever or a broken bone. It lived in silence, in misread glances, in sleepless nights, in the private ache of feeling cut off even when no one else could see it. In the 20th century, scientists began to notice that this quiet feeling might be more important than it appeared. In hospitals, in child development studies, in post-war research on separation, and later in laboratories that would raise deeply uncomfortable questions, the same pattern kept returning. Human beings did not simply prefer connection. They seemed to need it in ways that ran deeper than comfort. When those bonds were weakened, something in the mind and body began to change. Attention shifted, stress rose, sleep faltered, fear sharpened. Little by little, researchers began to suspect that loneliness was not just sadness, and not just a poetic way of describing modern life. It might be something much more serious and much more revealing. But even then, the mystery remained difficult to hold. What exactly were they studying? Was loneliness the same as being alone? The same as isolation, grief, depression, or social anxiety? Could it be measured? Could it alter the body? Could a feeling so private really help explain something about health, development, and the structure of society itself? These were not easy questions, and the answers did not arrive all at once. They emerged slowly, through insight and disagreement, through humane observation and troubling experiments, through decades of trying to understand why the absence of closeness could weigh so heavily on a human life. Tonight, we follow that story. We begin with a feeling almost everyone has known in one form or another, and we trace the long path by which science tried to make sense of it. What is loneliness? Once we look past the surface of the feeling itself, and what does it reveal about the kind of creatures we are and the kind of world we have built around us? Night can be a strange accomplice to loneliness. The world does not need to fall silent for the feeling to arrive. Sometimes it comes in the middle of ordinary sound, in the soft hum of a refrigerator, in the distant wash of traffic, in the pale glow of a phone screen that has not lit up in a while. You set something down, perhaps your keys, perhaps a bag, perhaps the tired thoughts of the day, and for a moment nothing seems wrong at all. The room is familiar. The walls are where they have always been. The air is still. And yet something inside the atmosphere shifts. A silence begins to feel heavier than silence should. A message left unanswered acquires a meaning it may not deserve. A face remembered from earlier in the day becomes harder to read in memory, as though the mind has quietly turned up the contrast on every uncertainty. Nothing visible has changed, and yet the world feels slightly farther away. What makes this feeling so elusive is that it does not arrive like a cut, a cough, or a fever. It leaves no obvious evidence behind. It rarely announces itself in words. More often it comes disguised as thought. You replay a conversation and wonder whether you said too much or too little. You think of a room full of people and remember not what was said, but the faint impression of being unheld within it. You scroll past images of other lives, other dinners, other smiles, and feel not exactly envy, not exactly grief, but a private thinning of connection. Even in company, loneliness can remain. A person can laugh, answer questions, do all the visible things that belonging requires, and still feel some invisible distance holding between themselves and the rest of the room. It is one of the strangest features of the human mind that a person can be surrounded by people and yet experience absence as if it were a presence for a long time. That was part of what made loneliness so difficult to understand. Human beings are good at noticing what can be seen. Hunger changes the body. Illness announces itself. Fatigue bends the posture and slows the voice. But loneliness often lives below the threshold of spectacle. It can hide inside routines, jobs, marriages, schools, cities, and crowded households. It can sit quietly behind competence. It can endure inside people who appear socially successful, articulate, even admired. That is why the feeling has so often been mistaken for a weakness of personality, or reduced to a sentimental complaint, or confused with simply being by oneself. And yet nearly everyone, at some point, knows that loneliness is something more difficult and more intimate than that. It is not merely the absence of bodies. It is the absence of felt closeness. It is the painful sense that one's inner life is no longer joined, in some meaningful way, to the lives of others. If you stay with that thought for a moment, the mystery begins to sharpen. Why should this matter so much? Why should the mind respond so strongly to something as intangible as disconnection? Why should a species capable of surviving hunger, cold, labor, disappointment, and grief be so unsettled by the simple feeling of not being met, not being held in relation, not being securely connected to others? These are not small questions. They touch something deep in the architecture of human life. For centuries, people described loneliness in poems, prayers, memoirs, and private letters. They knew the feeling. They feared it. At times, they even sought out forms of aloneness, retreat, or solitude, hoping to find peace, holiness, insight, or creative clarity. But loneliness itself, the painful version, the unwanted version, the kind that follows a person through crowded places and sleepless hours, remained oddly difficult to place. Was it a moral problem, a spiritual one, a social one, or a medical one? Was it a wound of the heart, a feature of modern life, or simply part of being human? The answer, when it began to emerge, did not come all at once. It did not begin in one famous laboratory with one triumphant discovery. It came slowly, from the edges, from people who were not always studying loneliness by name. Some were watching children separated from those who cared for them. Some were trying to understand what happened to people when the bonds of community thinned out. Some were observing what took place in the mind and body when social life became uncertain or strained. Long before loneliness became a recognized scientific topic, there were clues scattered across medicine, psychology, sociology, and ordinary experience. Clues suggesting that human connection was not just a pleasant addition to life, but something far more fundamental. Yet to begin here, in science, would be to move too quickly. Because before loneliness became a subject that could be studied, measured, and debated, it existed where all great scientific questions first exist, in the gap between what people feel and what they can explain. Imagine the difficulty of trying to study a feeling that changes with context, temperament, culture, and memory. Imagine trying to separate it from sadness, from grief, from anxiety, from depression, from shyness, from social withdrawal, from exhaustion, from the ordinary disappointments of being alive. Imagine trying to ask whether a person is lonely and discovering that the answer is not simply a number of friends, not simply a number of hours alone, not even simply whether they are loved. A person may have company and still feel unseen. Another may spend long stretches alone and not suffer at all. Somewhere inside that difference lay one of the most important clues. This is where the ordinary world begins to open into a deeper one. The more closely you look at loneliness, the less it behaves like a simple social fact. It begins instead to resemble a kind of hidden perception, a way the mind interprets its place among others. Two people may inhabit outwardly similar lives and yet experience them very differently. One feels securely woven into the fabric of family, friendship, neighborhood, or work. The other feels peripheral, uncertain, unseen. The difference is not only external, it is also inward, interpretive, lived. And once that possibility enters the story, loneliness stops looking like a mere lack of company and begins to look like something more subtle and more consequential. It becomes a question about the human nervous system, about expectation, about belonging, about the strange and delicate way the mind measures closeness. That subtlety is part of why loneliness can feel so private. There are forms of suffering that call witnesses. Loneliness often does the opposite. It withdraws from display. People carry it quietly because they do not want to appear needy, childish, burdensome, or somehow inadequate at life. In many cultures, especially modern ones, adulthood is often imagined as a kind of emotional self-sufficiency. To admit loneliness can feel like admitting failure, as though one has not mastered the basic social grammar of being a person. But this shame distorts the subject from the beginning. It makes the feeling seem rarer than it is, and more personal than it really is. In truth, loneliness is remarkably common. It moves through adolescence, midlife, old age, migration, illness, grief, work, parenthood, digital life, and crowded cities. It belongs not only to those who are visibly alone, but also to those whose lives appear full on the surface and hollow in the place where connection is actually felt. There is another reason the feeling has so often been misunderstood. Human beings tend to confuse loneliness with solitude, but the two are not the same. Solitude can be chosen and even cherished. It can feel restorative, clear, spacious, peaceful. Many people need it. Many creative, spiritual, or reflective traditions have honored it. To close a door for a while and be alone with one's thoughts is not necessarily a loss. Sometimes it is a form of relief. Loneliness begins where chosen aloneness is no longer enough, where distance becomes painful rather than nourishing, where the self feels cut off rather than simply quiet. That difference may sound small when spoken quickly, but it changes everything. It means that loneliness is not simply a count of who is nearby. It is an experience of disconnection, of insufficiency in the bonds that make life feel shared and held. Even that, though, is only part of the mystery, because once the feeling appears, it can begin to alter perception itself. A silence that might otherwise have passed unnoticed starts to feel loaded. A delayed reply becomes an injury. A neutral glance turns ambiguous. And ambiguity, under the pressure of loneliness, often leans in the direction of rejection. People do not always notice this shift while it is happening. They simply begin to feel that the social world has become harder to read. Other people seem less accessible, less warm, less predictable. And from there, a quiet feedback can begin. The more uncertain a person feels, the more carefully they may scan the world for signs of exclusion. The more carefully they scan, the more threat they may perceive. The more threat they perceive, the more guarded or withdrawn they may become. The outward world has not necessarily grown colder, but the experience of it has. Too, science would eventually notice. But before it became a formal idea, it was already there, living in countless private evenings, in misread texts, in strained pauses, in the tired mind rehearsing its own doubts. And so the subject begins, not in the grandeur of theory, but in small human scenes. A student eating among others, yet feeling impossible to reach. A widow in a quiet kitchen after years of shared routine. A child in a room that feels safe to everyone but them. A man in a crowded city whose life is full of contact and empty of intimacy. A woman who speaks to people all day and still ends the evening with the feeling that no one has truly seen her. These are not identical experiences. Their causes differ. Their ages, histories, and circumstances differ, but they share a common ache, a sense that something essential in social life has thinned or broken. Science would later give this ache categories, models, scales, mechanisms, and risk factors. Yet before all of that, there was the feeling itself, diffuse and immediate, known far more widely than it was understood. It is worth pausing here, because this is the threshold on which the whole documentary rests. If loneliness were only an unfortunate mood, there would be less reason to linger over it. If it were nothing more than poetic language for sadness, the story would remain in literature and private reflection. But the reason it drew the attention of scientists, slowly at first and then with increasing seriousness, is that it seemed to do more than merely hurt. It appeared to change behavior, attention, expectation, development, and health. It seemed to reach beyond emotion into the body and beyond the body into society. The more closely researchers looked, the less loneliness resembled a fleeting melancholy, and the more it resembled a signal, perhaps even a warning, something the human organism treated as important, whether or not the conscious mind knew how to describe it. That realization did not make the topic easier. In some ways, it made it harder. Once loneliness was taken seriously, every simple definition began to fail. It was not identical to being alone. It was not identical to social isolation. It was not identical to introversion, depression, or grief. It could coexist with love. It could hide inside relationships. It could afflict those surrounded by people and spare those who spent much of life in solitude. It could be acute and temporary, or it could harden into something more chronic, more structural, more difficult to escape. This complexity is one reason the science developed so slowly. Researchers first had to learn what they were even looking at. And that work, the work of clarifying the feeling without flattening it, would take decades. But before any field becomes formal, it usually begins with a simpler intuition, one that sounds almost obvious only after it has been said aloud. Human beings do not merely live beside one another. They are shaped by one another. The presence or absence of secure connection enters the self more deeply than older ideas of independence once allowed. To belong is not simply to be surrounded. It is to feel held within a network of recognition. Gotta trust, and mutual reality. To lose that sense, even temporarily, can be profoundly unsettling. In the modern world, with its speed, movement, institutions, technologies, and immense concentrations of anonymous life, this truth has only become harder to ignore. People can pass one another all day, exchange information constantly, and still feel emotionally unmoored. The surface of connection has multiplied. The felt reality of connection has not always kept pace. That gap between appearance and experience is part of what gives loneliness its peculiar modern shadow. It can exist where there is no obvious deprivation. A person may have contact without intimacy, communication without recognition, visibility without closeness. They may be known in fragments and still feel unknown in the places that matter most. This is not a defect in language. It is a clue. It suggests that the human need involved here is finer and more complex than simple proximity. We do not merely need to be near others. We need to feel linked to them in ways the nervous system can trust. Once that idea enters the story, the subject widens beyond mood and into something much larger. It begins to touch childhood, society, biology, cities, aging, love, technology, health, and the way a human being comes to feel real among other human beings. Perhaps that is why loneliness, though quiet, has never been a small topic. It sits at the meeting point of the most intimate and the most public parts of life. It belongs to bedrooms, buses, waiting rooms, classrooms, offices, hospital wards, nursing homes, sidewalks, and glowing screens in the dark. It belongs to private memory and public arrangement. It is shaped by personality, yes, but also by history, culture, family structure, neighborhood design, work, migration, illness, and the forms of attention a society teaches people to give one another. You can feel, even here at the beginning, that the story cannot remain inside one room. The feeling may begin there, in the soft unrest of a single evening, but its roots and consequences spread much farther. And this is where our path slowly turns. To understand loneliness, science had first to learn that the feeling was real in a way that could not be dismissed, but also elusive in a way that would resist crude explanation. It had to move carefully between the visible and the invisible, between what could be counted and what could only be felt. Long before researchers learned to measure loneliness directly, long before the topic became a recognized field of study, there were already thinkers noticing that something happened to human beings when the bonds around them weakened, frayed, or disappeared. The language was not always the same. The frameworks were not yet precise, but the intuition was there, waiting. So as this first quiet threshold recedes behind us, the question widens. If loneliness is more than solitude, more than sadness, and more than simply being by oneself, then when did people begin to sense that disconnection itself might carry consequences deeper than anyone had fully named? And how did an almost invisible feeling begin its long journey toward becoming an object of thought, history, and science? Those questions lead us outward now, away from the private room and into the changing worlds that gave loneliness some of its earliest meanings. And so the feeling that seemed to belong to one quiet evening, one room, one mind turning over its own unease, begins to widen into something larger. Behind every private ache, there is also a world, a set of customs, expectations, loyalties, distances, rhythms of daily life. A person does not feel alone in exactly the same way in every century, or under every social arrangement. Human beings have always known separation, grief, exile, abandonment, longing. But the meaning of being alone, and the emotional burden that gathers around it, has shifted over time. That is where this next movement of the story begins, with the slow historical change in what aloneness itself could mean. There were long stretches of history in which being apart from others did not automatically suggest emotional injury. In religious life, withdrawal from the crowd could appear as discipline, purification, even nearness to the divine. The hermit in the desert, the monk in his cell, the pilgrim walking beyond the ordinary circuits of daily life. These figures were not always imagined as broken by distance. Sometimes they seemed elevated by it. In more secular traditions too, the solitary scholar, the reflective philosopher, the poet wandering beyond the city's noise could carry an aura of seriousness, inward clarity, even authority. To step away from others could mean deprivation. Yes, but it could also mean thought, concentration, prayer, and a different kind of fullness. That older moral atmosphere matters more than it may first appear to. In many pre-modern settings, a person might spend time physically apart without experiencing that separation as an assault on the self. Family, village, parish, kinship, ritual. An inherited place often held the individual inside a denser field of belonging. These worlds were hardly idyllic. They could be harsh, unequal, intrusive, and merciless in their own ways. But they often supplied a structure in which identity was less radically individualized. A person knew who they were, partly because the world around them answered the question in advance. Their place was not entirely self-authored. It was named, recognized, and woven into a larger order that felt older than the individual life itself. In such settings, solitude could still hurt. Loss could still isolate. Widowhood, exile, poverty, disgrace, or the death of children could leave a person with a terrible sense of abandonment. There is no reason to imagine earlier societies as emotionally protected from loneliness. They were not letters, devotional writings, poems, and private journals preserve moments of inward estrangement that remain immediately legible even now. A human being cut off from affection has always suffered. But there is a difference between the existence of a feeling and the cultural shape it is given. A pain may be ancient, while the language, social conditions, and inward interpretation that sharpen it in one era may be comparatively new. As Europe and parts of the Atlantic world move through the early modern period and into the centuries that followed, that shape began to change, not in a single clean turn, and not everywhere at once, but steadily enough that later observers would recognize a transformation. Markets expanded, cities thickened, labor patterns altered, religious certainty weakened in some places and hardened in others. Old communal structures loosened, populations moved, households changed in size and function, privacy acquired new value. The individual, once more firmly enclosed within inherited networks, began to stand forward in a different way. With that shift came opportunity, mobility, privacy, self-fashioning, the promise of a life less strictly dictated by birth. But another possibility arrived alongside it. The self that gained freedom also became more exposed. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of modern life. More movement, more communication, more contact, and yet in many cases a greater risk of inward separation. A city may place thousands of people within walking distance of one another, and still leave enormous stretches of emotional distance between them. Privacy may protect dignity and thought, but it can also conceal distress more effectively. A shrinking household may allow intimacy in one sense while removing the broader texture of everyday presence that older social arrangements once provided. The person who must increasingly define, narrate, and sustain a life from within may experience failure of connection more sharply, because so much now depends on the self feeling recognized, mirrored, and securely placed among others. That changing pressure helped give loneliness a newer emotional contour, not an entirely new feeling. The heart of it is too old for that, but a new kind of prominence. Historians of emotion have often been careful on this point, and with good reason. It would be misleading to say that loneliness only belongs to modernity, as if earlier people had simply wandered through life without inward isolation. Yet it would be equally misleading to pretend that the feeling always carried exactly the same cultural weight. The modern world made certain kinds of self-conscious separation more visible. It intensified the inner significance of not being met, not being understood, not being held in relation, especially once identity itself became more psychological, more private, and less securely anchored by inherited roles. By the 18th and 19th centuries, literature begins to register this altered atmosphere with remarkable sensitivity. The person alone is no longer only holy, contemplative, or romantically self-possessed. He may be estranged, overstimulated, unmoored in the crowd. She may be trapped inside domestic forms that appear orderly from the outside, but offer no true emotional refuge. The city grows louder, denser, more anonymous. Mobility widens horizons while fraying old loyalties. Social life becomes more layered and performative. People move through drawing rooms, boarding houses, rented rooms, railway platforms, offices, streets, parlors, and salons with the unsettling sense that visibility does not guarantee closeness. One may be surrounded and still unknown. The modern novel understood this before science did. It lingered over characters who could not fully enter the worlds around them, not because they lacked language, but because the language between people no longer seemed to reach the deepest place where recognition should happen. A person could be spoken to, evaluated, admired, desired, married, entertained, and still feel uncannily untouched. That is a crucial shift. Loneliness, in this form, is no longer only about physical separation. It becomes something interpretive, relational, almost existential. It is a wound in recognition, the sense that one's inner life is not securely reflected back by others, that one's place in the human world has somehow become unstable. Once a culture becomes more attentive to that kind of suffering, the subject grows more complex. Loneliness can no longer be reduced to exile, widowhood, or abandonment, though it may include all of them. It can travel inside ordinary social life. It can hide in marriage, in work, in ambition, in respectability, in the midst of public competence. It can accompany a person into crowded rooms and leave them feeling, afterward, more sharply alone than before. This is one reason the modern vocabulary around aloneness begins to separate more clearly. Solitude retains associations with reflection, privacy, artistic concentration, retreat, chosen distance, Loneliness gathers around itself a different set of meanings. Ache, insufficiency, estrangement, the painful absence of felt companionship. Words matter here, because words do not merely describe emotional life, they help organize it. When a culture sharpens a distinction, it becomes easier to recognize certain experiences and harder to dismiss them as vague or interchangeable. Solitude could still be noble, healing, restorative, even necessary. Loneliness increasingly suggested that something had gone wrong in the relation between the self and the social world. That shift did not happen in perfect conceptual clarity. Writers continued to blur the two at times, and ordinary speech still does. But over time, the burden of loneliness thickened. The word began to carry more of modern inward life inside it. Its privacy, its longing, its insecurity, its fear that one might remain unseen, even in the presence of others. None of this means that older worlds were warm and modern ones cold. That contrast is too sentimental to be useful. Traditional communities could be suffocating, punitive, and cruel. They could reject difference, police behavior, and trap people inside obligations from which they desperately wished to escape. Modern life, for all its fragmentation, also created new forms of chosen belonging, friendships, movements, intellectual circles, professional communities, voluntary associations, urban intimacies, new households built less by inheritance than by affinity. The point is not that history moved from togetherness to isolation in a straight line. It is that the emotional significance of disconnection changed as the individual self was asked to carry more responsibility for meaning, identity, and relational fulfillment. That change was intensified by mobility, to leave home for labor, marriage, study, trade, or opportunity is not simply to travel. It is often to lose a dense web of minor recognitions that quietly make a life feel situated. The local shopkeeper who knows your family name, the street whose sounds have calibrated your sense of normal, the chapel bell or market rhythm that once anchored time, the accent in which your memories are most at ease. These things can disappear without sounding dramatic enough to count as catastrophe, yet their loss can expose a person to a more diffused estrangement, one that accumulates slowly. The self enters a new setting and finds that it must now explain itself more often, translate itself more carefully, or endure the feeling that it has become slightly illegible in the place where it now lives. Industrializing societies sharpen this experience in ways that many contemporaries found difficult to ignore. Boarding houses, tenements, factories, offices, trains, schools, and bureaucratic institutions brought bodies into dense proximity while thinning the quality of relation between them. One spoke, transacted, complied, performed, passed by, repeated routine after routine, and still returned to the evening with the sense that nothing essential had been exchanged. This was not always dramatic suffering. Often it was quieter than that. A gradual wearing down, a vague but persistent awareness that contact was abundant while intimacy remained scarce. In such conditions, the question of human connection could no longer be treated as merely sentimental. It became part of what it meant to understand the emotional cost of a changing society. Privacy, too, played a double role. It is one of modern life's great achievements and one of its quiet risks. To have a room of one's own, a protected interior life, a domain not constantly penetrated by kin, church, employer, or neighborhood can be profoundly liberating. Privacy allows thought, conscience, desire, concentration, and rest to unfold with a freedom not always available in more communal settings. Yet privacy also means that distress becomes easier to conceal. A person can suffer for years within an apparently functional life. Loneliness, in this setting, becomes both more available to introspection and more difficult for the surrounding world to notice. The modern self becomes richer in psychological language, and sometimes poorer in shared containment. Religious change added another layer to this transformation. In societies where meaning had once been carried, at least in part, through shared sacred frameworks, the weakening of those frameworks could alter emotional life in ways more subtle than belief alone. To lose a common horizon is not just to lose doctrine. It can also mean losing ritual repetition, shared moral time, communal consolation, and the sense that one's suffering is situated inside something older and more enduring than the private self. For some, that loosening opened space for freedom and self-direction. For others, it exposed a colder interior landscape. Loneliness, in this sense, hovered near the edge of secularization, not as its inevitable result, but as one possible companion to a world in which the individual increasingly stood alone before meaning. By the late 19th century, a cluster of overlapping concerns begins to gather more visibly. Social critics worry about atomization. Philosophers write about alienation and inward estrangement. Early sociologists think about weakened bonds, lost norms, the strains of modern life. Novelists continue to map subtle forms of emotional exile that arise not outside society, but within it. The vocabulary varies: alienation, isolation, estrangement, anomie, rootlessness, fragmentation, because the experience is still diffuse and the disciplines have not yet settled on common terms. But the underlying intuition keeps returning. Something in modern social organization may leave human beings exposed to a special kind of disconnection, one that is not fully captured by material hardship alone. That intuition matters because it changes who the lonely person appears to be. No longer simply unfortunate, weak, overly sensitive, or morally lacking. They begin to look, at least in part, like someone living inside a broader historical condition. The emotional life of the individual has become entangled with the structure of the age. A changing world enters the inner room. The ache inside one person may reflect not just temperament, but the way privacy, mobility, urban life, work, family, class, and cultural expectation are now arranged around them. This does not remove personal variation. Some people are more resilient, more socially secure, more temperamentally at ease in distance. But it does place loneliness in a larger frame, and that larger frame would prove crucial later. When thinkers began asking whether the thinning of human ties might shape not only feeling, but conduct and health, as new communication technologies appeared, the paradox deepened rather than disappearing. Faster exchange did not guarantee deeper understanding. Broader access to others did not automatically produce a stronger sense of being held by them. The modern self could be more visible, more mobile, more expressive, more connected in surface terms, and yet still haunted by the possibility of inward invisibility. One could be known in fragments and still remain unknown where it mattered most. That, too, is part of why loneliness came to feel increasingly distinct from mere aloneness. The question was no longer only who was physically nearby. It was whether one's life was joined to others in a way the mind and heart could trust. This is where the historical shift begins to press against science. Before anyone could measure loneliness, before any scale or survey or laboratory paradigm could give it more formal shape, the culture had to arrive at a more sharpened sense of what it was dealing with. A feeling once diffused among exile, sorrow, solitude, bereavement, and spiritual trial gradually acquired a clearer contour. It came to signify a lack of meaningful connection in a world where connection itself had become central to identity, intimacy, and emotional stability. That made loneliness easier to name and harder to dismiss. Yet naming a feeling is not the same as understanding it. The literary and cultural worlds had traced its outlines with great sensitivity, but they could not answer every question that the modern age was beginning to ask. Was this ache simply a reflection of changing expectations? Or did weakened bonds have consequences that reached deeper into human life? Could disconnection alter behavior, judgment, resilience, even survival? If so, where should one look first? To the city, to the family, to the body, to the developing child, to the structure of society itself? Those questions were waiting now, and the next people to approach them would not begin with loneliness as a clean scientific category. They would begin, instead, with a broader and more foundational concern. What happens when the ties that bind human beings to one another begin to loosen? And what kind of creature a person turns out to be when those ties are disturbed? Those questions did not lead, at first, to loneliness as a formal object of study. They led somewhere broader, and in some ways more revealing. Before researchers had the language, the scales, or the experimental frameworks to examine loneliness directly, they began by noticing something larger about human life, that people seem to depend on bonds, patterns, and shared structures in ways that are easy to overlook when those structures are intact. When they weaken, the change is often felt first as drift. A person still wakes, works, eats, speaks, moves through the day, yet the world no longer carries them with the same quiet certainty. The thread between individual life and collective life begins to loosen, and with it comes a question that would haunt modern thought for decades. What happens to a human being when the surrounding fabric no longer holds as firmly as it once did? This concern took shape in the 19th century, when European society was passing through enormous transformation. Industrialization was redrawing the map of daily life. Cities swelled. Work moved out of older household economies and into factories, offices, bureaucracies, transport systems, and wage arrangements that reorganized time itself. Village life did not disappear, but it could no longer be assumed as the central pattern of existence. The old local solidarities of kin, religion, guild, and neighborhood were strained by migration, class upheaval, and the impersonal scale of urban life. And in the midst of all this, social thinkers began to ask whether modern freedom had arrived with a hidden cost, whether a person released from inherited bonds might also become more vulnerable to forms of disorientation that were emotional, moral, and social all at once. This was not yet the language of loneliness, at least not in the way the later field would come to use it. The word was there, of course, in literature and ordinary speech, but the emerging sciences of society were not initially organized around a feeling. They were organized around relations, around membership, cohesion, obligation, ritual, law, moral order, and the strange dependence of the individual on structures that often remain invisible until they weaken. That shift in scale is important. It meant that disconnection was first treated less as a private ache and more as a pattern in the life of groups. The lonely person, in the scientific imagination, had not fully appeared yet. In their place stood a broader and more abstract figure, the individual whose link to the collective was uncertain. Few names stand more centrally at this threshold than Emil Durkheim. Writing in the late 19th century, Durkheim was concerned with the question that modern societies could no longer ignore. How do human beings remain bound to one another when the old forms of shared life are changing? He was not studying loneliness in the modern psychological sense. He did not offer a theory of silent evenings, unread messages, or the inward ache of feeling unseen. But he was trying to understand something adjacent and foundational: the degree to which individual life depends upon integration into a larger social order, and the consequences that follow when that integration weakens. Durkheim's world was one in which social dislocation could no longer be treated as a minor side effect of progress. Industrial society brought wealth, specialization, mobility, and innovation. Yet it also produced upheaval, inequality, fragmentation, and intense uncertainty. Old rules no longer governed every corner of life. New rules were still unstable. Individuals had to navigate desires, ambitions, identities, and choices under conditions less anchored by tradition than before. Durkheim sensed that this was more than a political or economic matter. It was also moral and psychological, a question of how much collective life a person needs in order to remain oriented within themselves. His most famous treatment of this issue came in Suicide, published in 1897. The book is often remembered today because of its bold claim that even an act as intimate and seemingly personal as suicide could show patterned variation across social groups. Durkheim argued that such variation could not be explained by individual psychology alone. One had to look at the degree of social integration and regulation surrounding a life. When ties were too weak, when people were insufficiently bound into stable collective frameworks, risk rose in characteristic ways. His argument was complex, and some parts of it have been revised or criticized since, but the core intuition was powerful. The individual does not stand outside society and merely happen to live within it. Society enters the individual far more deeply than common sense often admits. If you picture the intellectual shock of that claim, it helps explain why Durkheim still matters to this story. He was taking experiences long imagined as purely personal and showing that they could carry the imprint of social structure. A death could reflect a form of disconnection. A life could become fragile, not only because of private pain, but because the bonds around it had thinned. Durkheim's language was not the language of loneliness, yet he made one crucial move that the later science would inherit. He treated human connectedness as a condition of stability, not as a sentimental luxury. People required more than food, shelter, and individual freedom. They required placement in a moral world. This is where another of his concepts becomes important. Even if it has sometimes been simplified in popular retellings, Durkheim used the idea of anomie to describe a state in which norms become weak, confused, or unmoored, a condition often associated with rapid social change, economic upheaval, or the collapse of shared expectations. Anomie is not the same as loneliness. It refers more to normlessness, to a failure of regulation and moral orientation. Yet the emotional climate of anomic life can overlap with the experience of disconnection in ways that would matter later. A person may still be surrounded by others and yet feel cut loose from the frameworks that make action meaningful, limits intelligible, and desire governable. It is a more structural kind of unsettlement, but it lives in the same neighborhood of human vulnerability, around Durkheim, and sometimes against him. Other thinkers were approaching similar terrain from different angles. Ferdinand Tönnies had distinguished between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, often translated, roughly, as community and society, to describe different forms of social organization. In one, relationships are more intimate, inherited, affective, rooted in kinship and locality. In the other, they are more formal, contractual, impersonal, instrumental. This distinction was never meant as a simple nostalgic map from good to bad, but it offered a language for something many people felt in the modern age: that life organized through institutions and transactions can leave behind a longing for forms of relation that feel thicker, warmer, and more binding. Again, this was not a science of loneliness, yet it was part of the conceptual road that made later questions possible. Georg Simmel, writing about metropolitan life, noticed something else that belonged to this evolving picture. The modern city, he suggested, produces a special kind of psychological posture. Urban existence exposes people to relentless stimulation, innumerable encounters, fleeting transactions, and a level of sensory and social intensity that older village life did not demand. In response, the individual may cultivate a kind of reserve, a protective distance, an emotional filtering system, a blunting of response that helps preserve inner equilibrium in the face of constant contact. Simmel did not present this simply as a tragedy. It was also an adaptation. But the atmosphere he described is unmistakably close to one of modern loneliness's habitats: life among multitudes, where proximity is constant and intimacy remains uncertain. By the early 20th century, then, several lines of thought had converged without yet becoming a single field. Sociologists were examining weakened bonds, shifting norms, urban reserve, and the reorganization of collective life. Philosophers and social critics were worrying over alienation, estrangement, and the moral cost of modernity. Psychologists, still in the process of defining their own territory, were beginning to ask different questions about emotion, personality, development, and the unseen dimensions of human behavior. No one had yet assembled these threads into a modern science of loneliness. But the intellectual climate was changing. It was becoming less plausible to think of disconnection as a trivial or purely moral matter. One reason this transition took time is that disconnection is difficult to see clearly from the outside. A society can be productive, busy, and outwardly stable, while many of its members feel inwardly unmoored. The signs do not announce themselves neatly. They appear in despair, withdrawal, anxiety, susceptibility to crowd movements, loss of meaning, strained families, compulsive ambition, moral exhaustion, or lives that look functional from a distance and fragile from within. Social thinkers were therefore trying to read symptoms that did not always share the same cause. Disconnection could take the form of isolation, yes, but also confusion, overwork, uprootedness, anonymity, or the more diffuse pain of feeling unnecessary within the systems one helps sustain. This is why the early study of disconnection often seems more panoramic than precise. It it was not yet about one clean category. It was about the weakening of attachment between person and world. That world might be a family, a village, a church, a workplace, a class identity, a moral code, a political community, or the very idea of a social order that makes sense. To modern ears, some of this can sound abstract. Yet beneath the abstraction was a very human observation. When the networks that carry life become unstable, people do not merely lose structure around them. They may also lose structure within. The sociological imagination was especially powerful here because it challenged a deeply persistent illusion, the idea that the self is fundamentally self-sufficient, that inner life can be understood without much reference to the collective worlds in which it takes shape. Durkheim and those around him were, in different ways, arguing against that illusion. They were saying that membership matters, ritual matters, mutual expectation matters, social form matters. A person is not only an individual organism with private feelings. A person is also a node in patterns of relation that help determine what those feelings will mean, how resilient they will be, and how much strain they can bear before something begins to break. At the same time, this way of thinking had its limitations. Sociology could reveal that weakened ties mattered, but it was less suited to describing the felt texture of loneliness itself. It could show that certain forms of life correlated with fragility, despair, or diminished belonging. It could track institutions, roles, social categories, rates, and historical transformations. But the intimate psychology of disconnection, how it feels in the mind, how it alters perception, how it enters the body, how it may begin in childhood, long before society appears as an abstraction, remained harder to capture at that scale. The person in the statistics and the person alone at night had not yet fully met on the same page. Still, the groundwork was being laid. One of the most enduring contributions of this early period was the shift in moral tone it encouraged. If weakened ties could be studied as a feature of social organization, then disconnection was no longer merely a personal failing. The person who felt adrift might not simply be weak, oversensitive, or deficient in character. They might be living inside a pattern larger than themselves. This did not remove agency or erase individual differences, but it widened the frame of interpretation. It invited a more compassionate and more analytic view at once. That widening of the frame would become essential later, because loneliness research would repeatedly return to a tension already present here. Is the relevant unit the individual mind, with its habits of perception and feeling? Or is it the social world, with its institutions, norms, structures, and historical pressures? The later field would discover, again and again, that the answer could not comfortably remain on one side. Loneliness is lived subjectively, but it is also distributed through environments. It is personal, but never only personal. That duality was already visible in outline before the first loneliness scales were written or the first neuroscience papers were published. Another quiet but important legacy of this period lies in how it treated unseen dependencies. Modern culture often prizes autonomy, and in many ways rightly so. The freedom to choose, think, move, descend, and construct a life outside rigid inherited roles is a genuine achievement. Yet, the early sociology of disconnection revealed something sobering beneath that ideal. Human beings may celebrate independence, but they do not cease to require attachment, recognition, and a stable moral horizon. The language was different then. The methods were rougher, The conclusions were sometimes too sweeping. Even so, a crucial insight had entered public thought. An isolated individual is not simply a person with fewer companions. They may be a person whose social world has ceased to orient them. This is part of why the late 19th and early 20th centuries matter so much in the prehistory of loneliness science. They transformed diffuse cultural unease into a more disciplined question. They asked whether modern forms of life could generate systematic vulnerability through disconnection. They approached the issue through suicide, anomie, urban reserve, community decline, labor reorganization, and the weakening of inherited bonds. None of these was identical to loneliness, but together they made it harder to dismiss the possibility that human beings are injured in real ways, when social ties fail to hold. And yet one major piece of the story was still missing. The early sociologists were strongest when looking outward at institutions, group life, historical change, and the collective conditions that shape the individual. They were less able to see how the need for connection might begin much earlier, much closer to the body, and much closer to the first relationships in which a human being learns whether the world is safe, responsive, and dependable. They could describe drift, fragmentation, weakened norms, and diminished cohesion, but they had not yet descended into the nursery, the hospital ward, the parent-child bond, the earliest years in which connection is not a philosophical issue at all, but an organizing condition of life itself. That next movement would require a different kind of observer, not only the social theorist, but the clinician, not only the statistician of integration, but the watcher of children, not only the analyst of public life, but the researcher asking what happens to a developing human being when closeness is interrupted, inconsistent, or lost. The question of disconnection was about to grow more intimate, and in becoming more intimate, more biologically consequential than the early sociologists could yet fully show. That next movement brought the question inward, away from rates, institutions, cities, and social forms, and toward the earliest human bond of all. If the sociologists had shown that lives become fragile when the wider fabric loosens, the clinicians and developmental thinkers of the 20th century began asking a more intimate question. What happens when the first relationship, the one through which a child meets the world, becomes unstable, interrupted, or absent? Before loneliness could be studied as a feeling reported by adults, science had to learn something more basic, that connection is woven into development from the beginning, and that the young mind does not experience closeness as an emotional luxury. It experiences it as part of reality itself. In the aftermath of the First World War, and then even more starkly after the Second, this question could no longer remain abstract. Europe was filled with dislocation. Families had been fractured by death, displacement, evacuation, poverty, institutionalization, and long periods of separation. Hospitals and residential nurseries cared for children whose lives had already been marked by absence. The older assumption that infants simply needed feeding, cleanliness, and physical safety began to look less secure under these conditions. Some children survived physically and still seemed altered in ways that were difficult to explain. They were withdrawn, unresponsive, anxious, agitated, difficult to soothe, or strangely flattened in effect. Something in them appeared not merely deprived of comfort, but developmentally unsettled. This was the atmosphere into which John Bowlby stepped. He had been trained in medicine and psychiatry, and he also moved through the world of psychoanalysis, though never in an entirely obedient way. Bowlby was interested in emotional disturbance, juvenile delinquency, separation, and the quality of early attachment. But he was also unusually dissatisfied with explanations that floated too far from observation. He belonged to a generation still shaped by analytic thinking, yet he wanted a theory that could remain closer to ordinary life, to the actual bonds between children and caregivers, to what could be seen in grief, protest, clinging, detachment, and distress, rather than only inferred from symbolic fantasy. Part of Bowlby's sensitivity to these issues may have come from personal history, though one should be careful not to turn biography into simplistic explanation. Like many children of his class and era, he had experienced a rather formal early domestic life, with nannies, emotional distance, and separations that later commentators have sometimes seen as relevant to his intellectual preoccupations. Whether or not one leans heavily on that interpretation, it is clear that Bowlby developed an unusual seriousness about real separation. He was less interested than many of his contemporaries in treating the child's bond to the mother as merely derivative of feeding or fantasy. He suspected that closeness itself mattered in a more primary way. One early turning point came through his work with troubled children. In the 1940s, Bowlby published research on what he called 44 juvenile thieves, exploring links between delinquency and early experiences of separation and loss. The study has obvious limitations by modern standards, and some of its claims have been debated or criticized. Yet its importance lies in the direction it pointed. Bowlby was trying to understand whether disruptions in early care could shape later emotional life, social behavior, and the child's ability to form secure bonds. He was already moving toward a view that would later become central, that the presence of a stable, responsive caregiver is not simply comforting in a sentimental sense, but formative in the architecture of mind and behavior. War made the stakes of that view impossible to ignore. The mass displacement of children during and after World War II created an enormous, painful natural experiment. Evacuation, foster placement, institutional care, and long separations from parents produced situations in which children's responses could be observed with unusual clarity. Bowlby watched, and so did others, as children protested separation, despaired, withdrew, and in some cases seemed to enter a more alarming state of emotional detachment. The familiar language of "they will soon forget," or "young children are resilient if physically cared for," began to sound less convincing. Resilience existed, certainly, but so did damage. And the damage often took the form of relationship itself becoming harder to trust. In 1951, Bowlby's report for the World Health Organization, Maternal Care and Mental Health, gave this emerging view a much wider audience. The report argued that infants and young children need a warm, intimate, and continuous relationship with their mother, or a permanent mother substitute, and that disruptions in such care can have serious consequences for mental health. The language now sounds very much of its time, and later critics would question the report's breadth, its gender assumptions, and its tendency to place too much emphasis on one caregiving figure. Those criticisms matter. Yet the document was historically decisive because it crystallized a new seriousness around early bond disruption. What had often been treated as an emotional or moral issue was being reframed as a developmental one. Still, Bowlby's path was not smooth. His relationship to psychoanalysis was complicated, and that tension shaped the science, Classical psychoanalytic theory often emphasized the child's internal fantasies, drives, and symbolic world, sometimes at the expense of direct attention to real environmental conditions. Bowlby thought that balance had tilted too far. He wanted to treat actual separation, actual loss, and actual caregiving behavior as scientifically important in their own right. This put him at odds with influential analysts who believed he was becoming too empirical, too biological, too interested in observable attachment behavior rather than the deeper unconscious dramas they considered central. In a quieter way, the future science of connection was already being fought over as a question of method. Should one begin from the inner symbolic world, or from the visible relation between child and caregiver? Bowlby's eventual answer drew him toward ethology, the study of animal behavior. This was one of the most consequential turns in the intellectual history of attachment. Ethologists such as Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen had shown that young animals display patterned attachment-like behaviors following proximity seeking, distress upon separation, that cannot be reduced to feeding alone. Lorenz's work on imprinting in goslings, though not directly transferable to humans, offered a powerful image of early bonding as biologically organized. Bowlby saw in ethology a language for something he had long suspected, that the desire for closeness to a caregiver might be an evolved behavioral system, shaped by natural selection, because staying near protection increased survival. That move changed the entire tone of the conversation. Instead of asking whether children were over-dependent or merely comfort-seeking in a soft moral sense, Bowlby's framework suggested that seeking closeness under stress was built into the organism. An infant turns toward a caregiver because safety, regulation, and survival are bound up with that turning. Fear activates proximity seeking. Separation activates protest. The caregiver becomes a secure base from which the child can explore and to which the child can return. Under this view, attachment is not a cultural ornament placed on top of biology. It is part of the child's biological strategy for living in a world they cannot yet manage alone. This did not mean Bowlby had solved everything. Far from it. His work was sometimes interpreted too broadly, sometimes morally weaponized, and sometimes reduced to overly simple formulas about mothering. Later scholars, especially Michael Rutter and others, would push back against loose claims about maternal deprivation and insist on greater precision, distinguishing brief separation from chronic deprivation. Emotional neglect from physical absence, one caregiver from another, risk from inevitability. Science was refining itself, as it usually does. Yet the deeper shift remained. Researchers had begun to recognize that early disconnection could not be treated as a minor disturbance. It reached into development at a foundational level. If Bowlby helped supply the theory, Mary Ainsworth helped anchor it in patience. Disciplined observation. Ainsworth had worked with Bowlby, but she brought her own rigor and sensibility to the field. Her studies in Uganda and later in Baltimore paid close attention to how infants use caregivers as bases of security, how they explore, how they return, how they respond to departure and reunion, how patterns of responsiveness in everyday care shape the child's expectations. She was not content with vague generalities. She wanted to see how attachment looked in ordinary behavior, in daily rhythms, in the fine-grained movements of reassurance and uncertainty that make up early life. Her most famous contribution would later come through the strange situation procedure, developed in the 1960s and 1970s, in which infant responses to brief separations and reunions were observed in a structured setting. That work belongs slightly later in the chronology, but its spirit is already important here. Ainsworth made attachment visible. She showed that the child's relationship to a caregiver could be studied through patterns of exploration, distress, comfort-seeking, and reunion behavior. Some infants appeared secure, using the caregiver as a reliable point of return. Others showed avoidant, resistant, or later disorganized patterns. These categories have sometimes been oversimplified in popular culture, yet their scientific significance was profound. They made it possible to observe the early organization of connection without reducing it to vague intuition. What was taking shape across Bowlby and Ainsworth's work was not yet a science of loneliness in the adult sense, but it was clearly a science of human relatedness. And in that science, the child occupied a world very different from the one imagined by older moralistic accounts. The infant was not a blank vessel waiting to be filled, nor a bundle of instincts organized only around hunger. The infant was a being whose nervous system and emotional life developed within relation. Consistency mattered. Responsiveness mattered. Return mattered. The child's sense of safety was not merely a pleasant background feature of life. It was one of the conditions through which later social and emotional functioning would be built. This was one of the first truly biological clues in the story of loneliness, though it arrived by way of attachment. Early connection seemed to regulate more than mood. It organized expectation. It shaped whether other people would later feel reliable or uncertain, accessible or inconsistent, soothing or unpredictable. A child who learned through repeated experience that care arrives and distress is met does not simply feel better in the moment. That child may begin building an internal model of the social world as navigable. Another child, living with prolonged inconsistency, neglect, or rupture, may begin building a different model. The difference may not yet be called loneliness, but the future possibility of loneliness is already being prepared in the way the mind learns what others are for. There is a tenderness in this realization, and also something quietly unsettling. It means that the human need for connection is not something that appears late in life when adult relationships become complicated. It is there near the beginning, before language is mature, before memory becomes narrative, before the self can explain its own states. A baby does not think in words. I am lonely, yet prolonged disconnection, unrepaired distress, and unstable closeness leave traces. Science was starting to see that these traces might influence how one later approaches trust, separation, intimacy, and emotional regulation. The earliest bond was not merely one experience among many. It was part of the scaffolding through which social life would later be felt. At the same time, the new science had to guard against overstatement. Bowlby's early formulations were influential, partly because they were strong, perhaps too strong in places. The phrase maternal deprivation carried rhetorical force, but it could blur important distinctions. Children can form meaningful attachments to fathers, grandparents, adoptive parents, and other consistent caregivers. Temporary separations do not automatically produce lasting damage. Not every later difficulty can be traced neatly to infancy. By the second half of the 20th century, researchers were increasingly aware that development is probabilistic, not mechanical. Risk accumulates, but it does not dictate fate. Still, even these refinements left the core insight intact. Human beings develop in relation, and when relation is deeply unstable, the consequences can be serious. Hospitals and institutions provided some of the hardest evidence. Earlier in the century, Many nurseries and pediatric wards had operated under routines that minimized parental contact, partly out of concerns about infection, efficiency, and discipline. Children might be physically clean and adequately fed while being emotionally underheld. Observers such as Renee Spitz described hospitalism and anaclitic depression in institutionalized infants, patterns of withdrawal, delayed development, and emotional deterioration associated with prolonged deprivation of stable affectional care. Spitz's interpretations were not without dispute, and later researchers would question aspects of his methodology and framing, yet the images and descriptions had enormous impact. They made it harder to deny that affectional and relational deprivation could shape development in ways no feeding schedule could repair. In this atmosphere, the study of separation gradually changed the moral imagination of medicine and psychology. A child crying for a parent in a hospital ward could no longer be dismissed as merely difficult or spoiled. A young person who became detached after repeated disruption could no longer be understood only through discipline or character. The lens was shifting. Distress in the absence of trusted connection began to look lawful, even adaptive, the organism protesting a rupture that mattered for survival and regulation. Such a view did not sentimentalize dependency. It naturalized it. It suggested that needing others is built deep into the logic of human development, and that, in turn, changed the larger story we are following. The old concern with weakened social bonds, so vividly described by sociologists, was now joined by a more intimate discovery. The need for human connection did not begin in the city, or in modern work, or in the abstractions of society. It began in infancy, in the earliest negotiations of closeness, responsiveness, safety, and return. The social world, which had seemed so vast and historical in the previous section, now appeared in miniature in the nursery and the caregiving relationship. The broad question of disconnection had entered the body through the child. Yet even here, much remained unresolved. Bowlby and Ainsworth had brought connection closer to biology and development, but they had not fully shown how universal the need might be across mammals, nor how starkly behavior could be distorted when social bonds were radically stripped away. To press the question further, other researchers would move into experiments that are still deeply troubling to revisit, experiments that would force science to confront, with unusual clarity and moral discomfort, how much a living creature can come undone in the absence of touch, comfort, and relational security. That next step in the story is difficult to enter gently, though it must be entered carefully. Up to this point, the science of connection had been moving through children, caregivers, hospitals, separation, grief, and the gradual recognition that early closeness helps organize a human life from the beginning. But some researchers wanted harder proof, something more forceful, more controlled, more biologically direct. If attachment was truly fundamental, if touch and social comfort were not merely sentimental extras added onto survival, then could that be shown in the laboratory? Could a living creature be studied in ways that stripped connection down to its bare components and revealed what exactly it was doing? In the middle of the 20th century, one of the most influential and troubling answers came from Harry Harlow at the University of Wisconsin. Harlow did not begin as a scientist of loneliness in the modern sense. He was a psychologist working in comparative behavior, interested in learning, development, and the emotional life of primates. But the question surrounding attachment, separation, and early bond formation were already gathering force around him. The old assumption that infants love the mother because the mother feeds them still lingered in the background of psychology. Drive reduction models treated affection as secondary, almost derivative. A child or animal was thought to attach to the caregiver because the caregiver satisfied hunger, and the emotional bond grew out of that basic reinforcement. Harlow suspected the story was incomplete. Rhesus macaques, with their complex social lives and close maternal bonds, offered a way to test it. If nourishment were truly the central basis of attachment, then a young monkey should prefer the source of milk, whatever its texture or comfort. If something else mattered, warmth, softness, bodily contact, a sense of holding, then the animal's choices might reveal a deeper logic. This line of reasoning led to the most famous of Harlow's experiments, and to images that would become nearly impossible to forget. Infant monkeys were separated from their biological mothers and raised with artificial surrogate figures. One surrogate was made of bare wire and held a bottle from which milk could be obtained. Another was covered in soft cloth but offered no food. If the older theory were sufficient, the infants should have spent most of their time with the wire mother that fed them. Instead, they overwhelmingly clung to the cloth mother, retreating to it for comfort, holding on to it for long stretches, and using it as a source of security, even while briefly approaching the wire structure for milk. When frightened by a strange object or unfamiliar environment, they ran to softness. The bottle could sustain the body, but it could not answer the deeper need the experiment had uncovered. The phrase Harlow used for this was contact comfort, and it changed the conversation almost immediately. The infant, whether human or non-human, was not simply a hunger machine attaching itself to the nearest source of nourishment. It was a creature organized around closeness, touch, and felt safety. Comfort was not trivial. Warmth was not decorative. To be held, or to feel the equivalent of being held, seemed to play a role more foundational than many researchers had been willing to grant. Bowlby's theories of attachment had argued in this direction, but Harlow's monkeys seemed to make the argument visible in a way that was harder to explain away. The sight of a baby animal choosing softness over food moved through the scientific imagination with unusual force. And yet even here, one should be careful. The experiment was elegant in one sense, but it was also violent in the broader fact of what it required. These were infants deprived of their mothers and placed into controlled conditions that no ordinary life would choose. The clarity of the result depended on an engineered wound. That moral fact would become more troubling as the research program deepened, because Harlow did not stop at surrogate mothers. He and his colleagues moved further into the consequences of social deprivation. And there, the science became darker, much darker. Some of the monkeys raised in partial or total isolation developed disturbing patterns of behavior. They rocked repetitively, clutched themselves, froze, cowered, or failed to engage normally with peers. Others became unusually fearful, socially incompetent, or aggressively dysregulated. Monkeys deprived of ordinary maternal and peer contact during key periods of development often struggled later with mating, parenting, play, and social interaction. Their worlds had narrowed in ways that seemed to alter the very possibility of becoming an ordinary member of their species. The research did not merely suggest that social contact was pleasant or enriching. It suggested that without it, development itself could warp. This was one of the moments when the science of connection stopped sounding metaphorical. The organism did not merely prefer companionship. It required social relation for its behavioral life to mature in anything like a normal way. A monkey that had been radically deprived was not simply sad. It might become unable to play, unable to mate, unable to mother, unable to respond to others in stable and recognizably social ways. Harlow's work made it increasingly difficult to imagine attachment as a soft, psychological ornament layered on top of biology. The evidence implied that the need for security and social contact was embedded far more deeply than many earlier theories had allowed. There was, however, a terrible asymmetry in the work. The more dramatic the evidence became, the harder it was to separate scientific importance from ethical damage. Harlow constructed what he sometimes described in blunt and disturbing terms: isolation chambers, forms of rearing deprivation. Later, even devices that have become infamous under the name pit of despair. These setups were designed to induce profound withdrawal and depressive-like states in monkeys by severing ordinary social experience. Today, they are widely cited as examples of research whose ethical costs are shocking, even when their scientific influence is acknowledged. Many historians and psychologists continue to wrestle with the question of how to speak about them, whether to emphasize the insights gained, the cruelty involved, or both at once. The answer, perhaps, is that one cannot responsibly tell the story without holding both. Harlow's experiments provided evidence that changed developmental psychology, comparative psychology, and the broader understanding of attachment. They also did so through suffering deliberately imposed. That tension belongs to the history of science more often than anyone would like. Knowledge has not always been gathered under conditions that later generations would accept. The fact that a result is important does not soften the injury through which it was obtained. In this case, the injury was part of the design. The science of disconnection was learning from creatures forced into exactly the state the researchers wanted to study. Still, from inside the history of ideas, the shift was enormous. Before Harlow, it was easier for critics to dismiss attachment-centered thinking as speculative, over-emotional, or overly human-centered. After Harlow, such dismissal became harder. Here were non-human primates, in controlled settings, demonstrating that bodily comfort, security, and relational closeness mattered in their own right. Food alone could not organize healthy development. Physical survival alone could not produce social competence. To grow normally required more than nutrition and shelter. It required something relational, something contact-bound, something that tied the organism to others through calm, warmth, and regulation. This finding also helped bridge a gap that had lingered between sociology and developmental theory. The early sociologists had shown that weakened ties could unsettle adult life and public order. Bowlby and Ainsworth had shown that early caregiver bonds shape expectation, trust, and exploration. Harlow's work added a harsher layer, a cross-species demonstration that social deprivation can deform behavior at a level more basic than moral language had ever suggested. It is one thing to say that people need one another. It is another to watch an animal raised without ordinary closeness become frightened, repetitive, withdrawn, or incapable of normal maternal care. The abstraction falls away very quickly under those conditions. At the same time, the monkey studies were never a simple mirror of human life. That is important to say clearly. Rhesus macaques are not humans, and no single animal model can fully capture the richness, variability, and cultural complexity of human attachment or loneliness. Some later interpretations of Harlow's work were too sweeping. as if the studies had solved once and for all the question of how all social bonds function. They had not. What they had done was make a powerful and deeply unsettling case that certain kinds of contact and caregiving are developmentally central in mammals, and that deprivation can have long-term behavioral consequences. The translation to human life still required care, context, and restraint. Even so, the resonance with human observations was hard to ignore. Institutionalized children who received adequate food and hygiene, but little stable affection, had often seemed altered in ways older theories struggled to explain. Harlow's monkeys made those observations feel less anecdotal and more lawful. The image of a young creature reaching for softness under stress seemed to say, in an almost pre-verbal way, what many clinicians had already suspected. We are calmed by trusted contact. We regulate through relation. To be deprived of it repeatedly, or at the wrong developmental moment, is not emotionally neutral. It reshapes the organism's way of being in the world. Another consequence of the work was subtler, but just as important. It changed the psychological meaning of dependency. In many adult moral vocabularies, dependency is treated with suspicion. It suggests weakness, immaturity, or failure to become fully self-sufficient. Attachment theory had already begun challenging that idea by framing proximity seeking as part of the child's adaptive system. Harlow's experiments reinforce the challenge. The infant who seeks comfort is not displaying a defect. The drive toward contact under fear or uncertainty belongs to the architecture of development. Dependency, in this sense, is not the opposite of healthy life. It is one of the routes through which healthy life becomes possible. That insight would matter later when the science of loneliness turned toward adults. If a young mammal is built to seek regulation through closeness, then perhaps the adult organism does not simply grow out of the need for connection. The form changes. Of course, the infant's need for holding is not the same as the adult's need for friendship, intimacy, recognition, or secure belonging. But the deeper principle may endure, that social bonds are not optional decorations for an otherwise complete organism. They remain part of how fear is moderated, meaning is stabilized, and the self is kept from drifting into chronic distress. Harlow's work did not yet answer these adult questions directly, but it widened the biological foundation on which they could later be asked. It also forced psychology to reckon with timing. Social deprivation is not simply a dose that produces the same effect at every stage of life. Duration matters. Developmental window matters. Recovery matters too, but not always fully or easily. Some monkeys could improve when later exposed to peers or surrogate social conditions, especially if deprivation had been limited. Others remained profoundly impaired. This introduced a painful complexity into the science. Harm was neither wholly reversible nor wholly fixed. Relation could heal, but only within limits that depended on when and how damage had occurred. The same would later become a recurring theme in human research. Early disruption matters, but development is rarely a single irreversible sentence. By the 1960s and 1970s, Harlow's findings were circulating widely beyond comparative psychology. They entered developmental science, psychiatry, popular culture, and even public imagination in simplified forms. Some of that simplification was unfortunate. The phrase love could be used loosely, as though the experiments had solved everything about human affection in one dramatic stroke. They had not. Yet the broader movement of thought was unmistakable. Warmth, touch, proximity, comfort, maternal responsiveness, peer interaction, These were no longer peripheral curiosities. They belonged closer to the center of developmental explanation than many older schools had imagined. And with that shift came a change in how certain forms of suffering could be recognized. A child deprived of stable affectional care, an institutionalized infant, an adolescent who had never learned to trust closeness, an adult who struggled to form bonds after early rupture. These conditions began to look less like isolated moral or emotional oddities and more like variations on a deeper relational theme. The science still lacked the conceptual precision it would later develop. It was not yet speaking fluently about loneliness as distinct from separation, isolation, attachment insecurity, or social withdrawal, but it was slowly learning the terrain. It was learning that deprivation of connection does not remain confined to the moment. It can echo through later conduct, expectation, and social life. There is another, quieter reason this chapter matters. It revealed something about the limits of observation without empathy. In one sense, Harlow's experiments were ruthlessly empirical. They stripped away sentiment, language, and cultural noise in order to isolate variables. But the truth they uncovered was one that ordinary tenderness had perhaps always known in less formal terms. Young creatures need more than survival. They need soothing, warmth, continuity, trusted contact. The laboratory proved it in a way science could not ignore, but it did so by violating the very principle it was illuminating. The paradox is hard to escape. Some of the strongest evidence for the necessity of comfort was gathered by creating extraordinary discomfort. By the standards of contemporary animal ethics, much of this work would be unacceptable. That fact should not be softened. Research rules changed in part because scientists and the public increasingly recognized that certain forms of induced suffering could no longer be justified, even in the name of knowledge. The history matters precisely because it is unresolved. One can acknowledge that Harlow altered the science of attachment while also refusing to narrate the work as triumph. Its legacy is mixed, scientifically formative, morally disturbing, still debated in tone, if not in basic fact. And yet the field could not go back after this. The question had changed. No longer was it possible to ask only whether young creatures attach because they are fed, or whether separation distress is merely a habit. The evidence now pointed towards something more elemental. Connection helps organize development. Contact regulates fear. Deprivation can bend behavior in lasting ways. These were not the final truths of loneliness science, but they were among its first hard-edged biological clues. They made later researchers more willing to ask whether what begins in the nursery and appears in the monkey cage might also extend into the wider adult life of perception, emotion, cognition, and health. For all its darkness, this chapter of the story performed one essential intellectual task. It moved the need for closeness out of the realm of sentiment and into the realm of developmental fact. It made relationship feel less like a cultural preference and more like a condition to which living systems are calibrated. Once that calibration was visible, a new question followed almost inevitably. If human beings differ in the kinds of connection they lack, intimate bond, broader social network, felt belonging, actual contact, then how should those absences be named, separated, and measured? Before the science could go further, it needed sharper language. It needed to distinguish one kind of relational pain from another, and to turn a vast, blurred human experience into something that could be studied with more precision. That sharper language did not arrive all at once. For a long time, researchers were still circling around overlapping experiences that seemed related but refused to sit still under a single definition. One person lived alone and felt peaceful. Another was surrounded by family and felt painfully cut off. A third had many acquaintances, constant conversation, even professional success, yet ended each day with the sense that no one truly knew them. The older vocabularies of separation, isolation, attachment, grief, alienation, and social withdrawal were useful, but they blurred together too easily. If the science was going to move forward, it needed a clearer question. What exactly is loneliness? And how is it different from other ways of being apart? That was the quiet hinge on which the field began to turn. Until then, much of the story had unfolded through neighboring concerns. Sociologists studied weakened ties and dislocation. Developmental thinkers studied caregiving and separation. Comparative psychologists studied deprivation in other mammals. Yet loneliness itself, as a subjective human experience, still lacked a stable scientific shape. It was familiar enough in literature, private memory, and ordinary speech. But science needed more than familiarity. It needed distinctions that could hold under scrutiny. It needed concepts narrow enough to measure and broad enough to remain faithful to lived reality. One of the most important figures in this transition was Robert S. Weiss. Weiss did not make loneliness dramatic in the way certain later researchers would, and he is not always the first name that appears in popular accounts. Yet his contribution was foundational because he helped clarify what the field had been groping toward for decades. In his work during the 1970s, especially in loneliness, the experience of emotional and social isolation, he argued that loneliness is not one thing in one form. There are different kinds of absence, and they do not wound in the same way. A person may ache for one irreplaceable intimate bond, the absent spouse, the lost partner, the trusted confidant, or they may suffer from the absence of a broader circle of shared life, a network of companions, colleagues, neighbors, or community. These experiences overlap, but they are not identical. This distinction between emotional loneliness and social loneliness sounds almost obvious once it is stated. That is often how conceptual breakthroughs work. They seem self-evident after someone has done the difficult labor of making them clear. Emotional loneliness points toward the absence of a close attachment figure, the kind of bond through which a person feels deeply known, reassured, and inwardly held. Social loneliness points toward the lack of an engaging network, a sense of belonging to a wider circle in which companionship, shared activity, and ordinary participation can take place. One loss is intimate and piercing. The other is broader, more ambient, sometimes less dramatic on the surface, yet capable of saturating daily life with a flat sense of exclusion or drift. That mattered enormously, because it explained why loneliness had been so difficult to handle as a scientific subject. Researchers had often been trying to study one experience while accidentally mixing it with another. They might look at widowhood, urban isolation, friendlessness, shyness, or institutional life, and assume they were dealing with the same core phenomenon. Weiss's work helped reveal that two people can both say, "I am lonely," while referring to very different forms of deprivation. One may long for a single irreplaceable person. Another may lack the ordinary social environment that makes a week, a month, or a life feel shared. Once that distinction entered the field, the science became more precise, and at the same time, more humane. There was a deeper shift inside this as well. Loneliness was being defined less by objective circumstance and more by subjective experience. That was not an easy move for science to make, because objective facts are simpler to count. How many people live in the household? How many social contacts occur in a given week? How often does a person leave the home? How many friends can be named? Those are measurable things, and they remain useful, but none of them on their own can tell the whole story. Someone can have very few contacts and feel richly connected. Someone else can be continuously surrounded and feel profoundly alone. The field had to accept that loneliness belongs to the person's perception of relational insufficiency, to the felt gap between the connection one has and the connection one needs, expects, or longs for. That insight sounds straightforward, but it caused trouble almost immediately. If loneliness is subjective, then how do you measure it without flattening it? If it is an inward experience, how do you distinguish it from depression, social anxiety, grief, low self-esteem, or transient disappointment? If people feel ashamed of loneliness, how do you know whether they will report it honestly? And if the meaning of connection varies by culture, age, personality, and circumstance, how do you build a scientific instrument that captures something real rather than merely forcing complexity into a neat statistical shape? These were not minor technical concerns. They were the conditions under which the field either matured or remained permanently vague. By the 1970s, psychology was increasingly comfortable with psychometrics, the effort to transform subjective states into measurable constructs through carefully designed questionnaires and scales. Intelligence, depression, anxiety, attitudes, personality traits, and social variables were all being studied through instruments that tried to make inward life legible in numerical form. Loneliness was a natural candidate for this approach, but it was also a difficult one. Unlike hunger, blood pressure, or reaction time, loneliness could not be directly observed in a laboratory. It had to be inferred from report, pattern, and consistency. The scale would have to do more than ask, "Are you lonely?" It would need to detect the condition, even when people were reluctant to name it plainly. This is the world in which the UCLA loneliness scale emerged. Developed initially by Daniel Russell, Leticia Peplau, and colleagues in the late 1970s, the scale became one of the most influential tools in the field. Its importance did not lie only in its popularity. It mattered because it approached loneliness as a measurable subjective state with recognizable signs. Instead of relying solely on direct self-labeling, the items asked about relational experiences and perceptions, feeling left out, lacking companionship, being isolated from others, feeling that there are people one can turn to. Over time, the scale was revised and refined, but its larger achievement remained the same. It gave researchers a way to treat loneliness as a coherent construct that could be compared across studies, populations, and years. There is something quietly consequential about that moment. The moment when a feeling becomes a score. It is easy to view psychometric scales as dry instruments, bureaucratic devices for shrinking messy life into columns of data. And sometimes they do carry that danger, but they can also open a field by creating a shared language. Before the scale, loneliness could be discussed endlessly and still remain hazy. After it, researchers could begin asking more systematic questions. Which groups report higher levels? How stable is loneliness over time? Does it cluster with certain health outcomes? Patterns of thought, forms of social life, or life transitions? A questionnaire could not solve the mystery, but it could make the mystery more tractable. Of course, every act of measurement also changes the thing being measured. Once loneliness became a scale, it entered a new intellectual world, the world of surveys, correlations, longitudinal studies, and epidemiology. That was both productive and risky. Productive because it allowed the field to grow. Risky because numbers can create an illusion of clarity that the underlying experience does not always deserve. A score can tell us that someone reports more loneliness than someone else. It cannot, by itself, reveal the full texture of that loneliness, whether it is rooted in bereavement, migration, a loveless marriage, neurotic vigilance, social exclusion, chronic illness, stigma, or the quiet erosion of community. The best researchers understood this. Measurement was a beginning, not a replacement for interpretation. The 1970s and 1980s also brought a broader expansion of social psychology and relationship research, which helped loneliness find a more stable home. Researchers were increasingly interested in social support, intimacy, friendship, marital satisfaction, social networks, and the role of interpersonal processes in mental health. Loneliness could now be studied alongside these topics rather than floating at the margins as a vague human complaint. Leticia Peplau, among others, played an important role in this emerging literature, examining how loneliness related to expectations, personality, and social circumstances. What took shape in these years was not yet the full biological science that would come later, but it was a crucial intermediate step. Loneliness was becoming a legitimate research domain rather than an embarrassing or overly literary subject. Still, the field remained full of confusion, and that confusion is part of the story. Loneliness could not simply be equated with isolation. Social isolation refers more to objective separation, low contact, few relationships, limited participation in social networks. Loneliness refers to the subjective experience of insufficient connection. The two often overlap, but they do not always travel together. This distinction seems basic now, but it had to be repeatedly defended because common sense keeps trying to collapse them into one another. Researchers had to insist, again and again, that the inward experience matters independently of visible circumstance. The person living alone is not automatically lonely. The person constantly in company is not automatically protected. Then there was the problem of neighboring conditions. Depression often includes social withdrawal and feelings of emptiness. Social anxiety can produce isolation and fear of interaction. Grief brings aching absence after loss. Introversion may involve a preference for lower levels of stimulation and social contact. All of these can intersect with loneliness, but none of them is identical to it. That meant the science had to become careful about boundaries. If a scale measures sadness in general, it may overstate loneliness. If it measures sociability, it may mistake introversion for relational pain. If it focuses too much on quantity of interaction, it may miss the person who feels unknown inside a crowded life. The field matured partly by learning where loneliness ends and other concepts begin, even if those borders are sometimes porous. There was also a social challenge beneath the methodological one. Loneliness is a stigmatized state. People often hesitate to admit it, even to themselves. It can feel like a confession of failure, a sign that one is socially unwanted, emotionally inadequate, or somehow deficient in the basic work of being human. Researchers knew that direct questions might trigger defensiveness or shame. This is one reason indirect item wording mattered so much. Instead of demanding a blunt self-label, Scales could approach loneliness through its contours, through feelings of exclusion, lack of companionship, or insufficient closeness. In that sense, psychometrics was doing more than counting. It was learning how to ask gently enough that the truth might answer back. As the field clarified its concepts, it also changed the tone of the broader conversation. Loneliness was starting to look less like a private weakness and more like a patterned, measurable human experience. That shift did not remove the pain or the stigma overnight, but it altered the moral frame. Once something can be studied systematically, it becomes harder to dismiss as mere oversensitivity. A widowed woman, a first-year student, a recent immigrant, a chronically ill man, a new parent cut off from ordinary companionship, an older adult whose friends have died. These lives could now be examined in terms of relational experience without reducing everything to personal failure. Science was supplying a vocabulary in which loneliness could be discussed with more precision and, potentially, more compassion. At the same time, a quieter question lingered under the surface. If loneliness is subjective, if it involves how one interprets the adequacy of one's relationships, then perhaps the decisive action is happening partly inside perception itself. Two people with similar circumstances may experience them very differently. One feels supported, the other overlooked. One interprets a quiet weekend as restful, the other as proof of abandonment. One delayed response seems trivial, another feels loaded with rejection. The field was beginning to suspect that loneliness did not simply describe the absence of connection. It might also shape how the social world is read. That idea had not yet been fully developed, but it was waiting in the wings. Another reason the field needed time to consolidate was that scales and categories, useful as they were, did not automatically explain causation. A high loneliness score could correlate with poor sleep, low well-being, depression, or health complaints. But correlation alone cannot tell us whether loneliness causes these outcomes, results from them, or interacts with them in cycles. The science at this stage was rich in description and increasingly sophisticated in measurement, but still searching for mechanisms. What exactly does loneliness do? How does it get under the skin? Through stress, through behavior, through cognition, through the immune system, through the lingering influence of early attachment. These questions could now be asked more cleanly because the construct itself had become clearer. One might say that this was the moment loneliness stopped being only a theme and became a field. It now had concepts, distinctions, scales, comparative studies, and an expanding community of researchers. It could be approached statistically, developmentally, socially, and psychologically, yet the field's maturation did something else as well. It sharpened the sense that loneliness was not a single dramatic event. It could be ambient, chronic, episodic, situational, developmental, or relationally specific. It could rise after bereavement or persist through decades. It could accompany success, illness, adolescence, relocation, disability, stigma, or institutional living. The science was learning to respect its multiplicity without dissolving it into chaos. And once multiplicity is acknowledged, another truth becomes harder to ignore. Different absences may hurt through different pathways. The lack of a spouse does not feel exactly like the lack of a friend. The absence of community does not operate exactly like the absence of intimate trust. A life can be full of contact and still starved of emotional depth. or rich in one deep bond and painfully lacking in everyday social participation. Weiss had helped articulate this. The scales made it testable. The field was now in position to ask not only who is lonely, but what kind of loneliness they are enduring, and how different forms of insufficiency may echo across emotion and behavior in distinct ways. By the late 20th century, all of this had created the conditions for a much more ambitious scientific turn. Loneliness was no longer too vague to study, nor too literary to quantify, nor too morally embarrassing to treat as legitimate. Researchers had learned to distinguish it from isolation, to parse some of its internal varieties, and to gather systematic data. That did not make the experience any less intimate. If anything, it revealed how widespread and structurally important it might be. Once a feeling can be measured, it begins to show up everywhere, in campuses, marriages, neighborhoods, nursing homes, workplaces, cities, and populations previously treated as separate stories. And that is where the next transformation begins. Because after loneliness acquired clearer definitions and instruments, researchers became able to pursue a more unsettling possibility: that this subjective experience was doing something active inside the human organism, not merely reflecting sadness or social absence, but altering attention, expectation, stress, sleep, physiology, and the body's relationship to the world. The field had finally named the wound with enough clarity to ask what it does once it takes hold. And once the field had language sharp enough to name loneliness with some precision, the question shifted again, from description to mechanism, from what loneliness is to what it does. A scale could tell researchers that some people felt chronically isolated even when others around them did not. It could show patterns across age, circumstance, and social life. But it could not yet explain why that state seemed to matter so much. Why should a subjective sense of insufficient connection alter sleep, attention, stress, and health? Why should the organism respond to a feeling of social disconnection with such seriousness? In the closing decades of the 20th century, this became one of the most important turning points in the field. And one of the names most closely associated with that turn was John T. Cacioppo, a pioneer of social neuroscience whose work helped move loneliness from the margins of psychology into a broader biological and neuroscientific frame. Cacioppo's importance lay partly in temperament and partly in method. He belonged to a generation of researchers increasingly unwilling to leave social life outside the body, as though relationships mattered emotionally but stopped at the skin. Social neuroscience, the field he helped build, began from a different assumption: that social processes and biological processes are braided together, and that neither can be fully understood in isolation. This did not mean reducing love, friendship, or loneliness to brain scans. It meant asking how social experience gets under the skin, how it shapes attention, physiology, hormone systems, immune signaling, and the way the mind interprets the world. Loneliness, in this emerging frame, was no longer only a sorrow to be described. It was a condition that might reorganize perception and bodily regulation in measurable ways. One of the most influential ideas to emerge from this work was that loneliness may function, at least in part, like an alarm signal. The argument was subtle. Hunger tells an organism something about nutritional need. Thirst signals fluid need. Pain warns of tissue damage or threat. Loneliness, Cacioppo and Louise Hawkley suggested, may be an aversive state that evolved because social species require reliable bonds for protection. cooperation, and survival. Under that view, loneliness is unpleasant for a reason. It pushes attention outward toward the problem of reconnection. But chronic loneliness complicates the picture because a signal designed to help can become prolonged. And when it does, the organism may enter a more defensive mode that begins to change how ordinary social life is perceived. That is where the so-called loneliness regulatory loop enters the story. Hockley and Cacioppo described a pattern in which perceived social isolation heightens vigilance for social threat. A person who feels cut off may begin scanning the world more carefully for signs of exclusion, unreliability, indifference, or possible harm. From one angle, that is understandable, even adaptive in the short term. If your bond to others feels uncertain, caution may seem wise. Yet the same vigilance can bend interpretation in ways that deepen the original wound. Neutral interactions begin to look colder. Ambiguous expressions are read more negatively. The lonely person may become more guarded, less trusting, more likely to withdraw or respond defensively, which can in turn make warm connection harder to sustain. The loop closes on itself. This was an elegant model because it preserved something true about lived experience. Loneliness does not merely describe an absence. It can alter the atmosphere of the social world. A delayed reply grows sharp. A brief silence becomes loaded. A room of people becomes harder to read. The science was beginning to suggest that these changes were not simply poetic exaggerations. They reflected a mind that had shifted into a more threat-sensitive state. Cacioppo's group and others found evidence that perceived social isolation was associated with cognitive biases toward negative social information and with changes in how social stimuli were processed. The lonely person was not imagining a different world from nothing, but they might be encountering the same world under a more defensive interpretive light. As this work deepened, researchers began tracing loneliness into domains that had once seemed far away from a feeling. Sleep was one of them. Loneliness had long been associated in ordinary life with restless nights, replayed conversations, and the inability to settle, but systematic research gave that intuition a sharper shape. Studies linked loneliness with poorer sleep quality, more fragmented sleep, and greater wakefulness after sleep onset. And later meta-analytic work supported a broader association between loneliness and disturbed sleep across populations. The proposed logic fit the vigilance model. If the organism experiences social disconnection as a condition of reduced safety, then deeper rest may become more difficult, the body remaining, in a sense, less fully off duty. Cardiovascular and stress-related pathways also began to enter the picture. Research from Hockley, Cacioppo, and colleagues found that loneliness predicted increases in systolic blood pressure over time in middle-aged and older adults, even when other variables were taken into account. Other work linked loneliness with altered neuroendocrine and inflammatory stress responses. The exact causal pathways are complex, and no single biomarker can summarize the whole phenomenon. Still, the broad pattern was increasingly difficult to ignore. Perceived social isolation seemed to travel with a physiological burden, not one dramatic enough to resemble acute trauma, but cumulative, chronic, and potentially consequential when carried across years. What made this especially striking was that the crucial variable was often not objective isolation alone, but perceived isolation. Two people can live in outwardly similar conditions and show very different internal realities. One feels embedded, the other cut off. One experiences ordinary contact as meaningful, the other as thin and unstable. Cacioppo's work repeatedly returned to this point. The organism appears to respond not only to how many people are present, but to whether the social world feels dependable enough to downshift from vigilance. In that sense, loneliness is deeply psychological without being merely in the head. It is interpretive. Yes, but interpretation, in social species, is one of the routes by which physiology is regulated. This is also why the field gradually moved away from the idea that loneliness could be solved simply by adding more social contact. If the mind has entered a suspicious, threat-sensitive mode, quantity alone may not repair the experience. A crowded workplace, a busy family, an active social calendar. None of these guarantees felt safety or recognition. The issue is not only exposure to others, it is the meaning and trustworthiness of those encounters, and the interpretive habits through which they are received. That insight would later matter for interventions, because it suggested that loneliness is sustained not only by absence, but also by how the social world is cognitively and emotionally navigated. At roughly the same time, another line of research made the field far more visible to the public imagination. In 2003, Naomi Eisenberger, Matthew Lieberman, and Kipling Williams published the now famous fMRI study Does Rejection Hurt? Using the cyberball social exclusion paradigm, they reported that being excluded in a virtual ball tossing game activated regions including the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula, areas associated with the affective component of physical pain. The finding was immediately compelling because it appeared to give neural weight to an intuition people had long expressed in metaphor. Rejection hurts. The phrase was no longer only literary. It seemed to have a map in the brain. The social pain framework built from there. Eisenberger and colleagues argued that because close bonds are crucial for mammalian survival, evolution may have partially co-opted systems involved in physical pain to make social disconnection feel urgent and difficult to ignore. A common neural alarm system, in this view, would help explain why exclusion, rejection, and loss can feel immediate and bodily rather than abstract. Later work expanded the picture, suggesting overlap, especially in the affective, rather than sensory, components of pain, and showing links between social distress and physical pain sensitivity. The theory did not claim that heartbreak and a broken bone are identical experiences. It claimed that they may draw, in part, on related systems for signaling threat and motivating response. For the loneliness story, this was enormously attractive. It seemed to fit what so many people felt in private life, that rejection, exclusion, or chronic disconnection can land with a force that feels bodily real. It also fit the broader shift social neuroscience was trying to make. The old divide between real physical pain and mere emotional suffering was becoming harder to defend. Yet as influential as the social pain account became, it also generated serious debate. And those debates matter if we want an honest picture of the field. Some researchers argued that the overlap had been overstated, that brain regions like the anterior cingulate and insula are involved in many kinds of salience, conflict, and distress, and that shared activation does not by itself prove a single underlying pain system. In other words, the argument was never simply won by one dramatic scan. Neuroimaging is powerful, but it is also interpretively delicate. A region can be active in multiple contexts. A meaningful parallel can exist without perfect equivalence. Later work often adopted a more careful formulation. Social rejection and physical pain appear to overlap, especially in their affective alarm functions. while differing in other phenomenological and neural respects. Cross and colleagues, for example, supported continued overlap while also helping refine which aspects of pain were most plausibly shared. The best version of the social pain story, then, is neither a dismissal nor a triumphalist slogan. It is a strong, influential, and still carefully debated account of why social injury can feel urgent in the body. This debate actually strengthened the field in one sense. It forced researchers to ask more precise questions. Are lonely people more sensitive to rejection because they feel more pain in a literal neurobiological sense, or because they become more vigilant, more self-protective, more likely to interpret ambiguity negatively? Are physiological consequences driven by loneliness directly, or by sleep disruption, stress behavior, reduced activity, poorer health habits, and accumulated allostatic load? The answer increasingly looked multi-level. Loneliness was not one mechanism. It was a condition that could influence cognition, emotion, stress physiology, sleep, and behavior in overlapping ways. Social neuroscience was most persuasive, not when it reduced everything to a brain region, but when it showed how perception, context, and biology interact. One reason John Cacioppo remains so central in all this is that he resisted narrow reductionism. His work on loneliness did not stay confined to imaging or physiology alone. It moved across levels: self-report, social behavior, cognitive bias, endocrine responses, cardiovascular measures, health outcomes, even gene expression in some related lines of research on social context. That breadth helped loneliness science mature into something more than a set of isolated findings. It became a model of how a social perception can propagate through the organism. The brain, in this framework, is neither the whole story nor irrelevant to it. It is one part of the loop through which disconnection is felt, interpreted, and embodied. There was another important implication here. Loneliness began to look self-reinforcing in time. A person feels socially unsafe. Vigilance rises. Sleep worsens. Stress regulation shifts. Social encounters become harder to interpret generously. Withdrawal or guardedness increases. Opportunities for affirming connection may narrow, or be harder to perceive even when present. The longer that cycle persists, the more loneliness can begin to resemble a trait-like condition. Though many researchers remain careful to distinguish chronic loneliness from transient episodes. This is one reason the field never fully settled for just go meet people as an explanation or a cure. The organism that has adapted to perceived social threat may not step easily back into trust. At the same time, the modern science did not erase older truths about variation and resilience. Not everyone exposed to loss, relocation, widowhood, illness, or social disappointment becomes chronically lonely. Not everyone with a high loneliness score shows the same physiological profile. Mechanisms vary across age, development, culture, personality, and health status. Some people recover as conditions change. Others remain vulnerable for much longer. This variability is not a flaw in the science. It is part of what the science is trying to explain. A common signal may exist, but it is filtered through biographies, attachments, expectations, and bodies that are never identical. Even with those complexities, by the early 21st century, the field had changed human understanding in a lasting way. Loneliness was no longer easily dismissed as an overly delicate emotion or an incidental byproduct of modern life. It had become a serious topic in psychology, neuroscience, behavioral medicine, and public health, because it appeared to alter how the social world is read and how the body carries strain. The old oppositions, emotional versus physical, private versus biological, social versus medical, had become harder to sustain. A feeling inside one person could, over time, leave marks in sleep, blood pressure, distress regulation, attention, and health. And yet, one further widening remained. Once loneliness had been reframed as a biologically consequential experience, the question became larger than mechanism alone. If chronic disconnection can shape the organism, then it is no longer only a matter for theorists of attachment or social neuroscientists studying vigilance and pain. It becomes a population issue, something that may accumulate across age groups, neighborhoods, institutions, illnesses, and whole societies. The next movement of the story begins there, where a private feeling starts to appear in the language of risk, aging, mortality, and public life. And from there, the frame widens one last time. Once loneliness had been shown to alter attention, stress, sleep, and health-related processes, it could no longer remain only a subject for relationship researchers or social neuroscientists. A feeling that once seemed almost embarrassingly private had begun to look like something larger, something that might accumulate across populations, institutions, and ordinary forms of life. The question was no longer only what loneliness does inside one person. It was also what happens when large numbers of people carry it at once, quietly, across years, across cities, across entire age groups, often without the surrounding culture fully noticing. For a long time, older adults stood near the center of this public conversation, and there were understandable reasons for that. Bereavement, retirement, chronic illness, hearing loss, reduced mobility, shrinking social networks, and the slow disappearance of contemporaries can all make later life more vulnerable to both isolation and loneliness. The National Academy's major 2020 report treated loneliness and social isolation in older adults as serious public health concerns, especially because of their associations with mortality, cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, depression, and diminished quality of life. Yet even that report was careful not to flatten aging into stereotype. Older age is a period of risk for some people, not a synonym for loneliness itself. That caution matters, because one of the most important changes in recent years has been the recognition that loneliness is not only, or even primarily, an old age story. The World Health Organization's Commission on Social Connection reported in 2025 that loneliness affects all age groups and all world regions, with around 1 in 6 people globally reporting loneliness. Its findings also pointed to especially high prevalence among adolescents and young adults, with rates around 1 in 5, and even higher burdens in lower-income countries. In other words, the public image of loneliness as something that belongs mainly to late life has been overtaken by a more complicated and more unsettling reality. That shift changes the emotional meaning of the subject. It is one thing to imagine loneliness as an almost inevitable companion to frailty, widowhood, or old age. It is another to realize that teenagers, university students, young workers, recent migrants, and digitally connected adults may be among those most likely to report it. The old assumption had been that youth, by sheer proximity to peers and novelty, must be socially buffered. The newer evidence suggests otherwise. A person can be immersed in networks of communication and still feel unchosen, unheld, or perpetually outside the circle where belonging becomes real. The technologies of contact do not automatically create the experience of connection they seem to promise. That is part of why institutions began to change their tone. In 2023, the Surgeon General's Advisory, Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, framed social disconnection as a major public health issue and explicitly compared the need for social connection to other essential conditions of long-term well-being. The language was striking because it represented a change in what governments were willing to say aloud. Social connection was no longer being treated as a private preference or a soft social ideal. It was being described as something that affects individual and societal health in ways serious enough to justify coordinated attention. WHO's 2025 report pushed this even further onto the global stage. It described loneliness and social isolation as widespread, serious, and still under-recognized, and it linked them to substantial burdens on health, education, work, and social life. WHO also summarized evidence that loneliness was associated with more than 871 zero deaths annually between 2014 and 2019, a figure often rendered, with deliberate clarity, as roughly 100 deaths an hour. Such framing can sound alarm-like, and there is always a risk that public health language oversimplifies a complicated science. But it also reflects a genuine shift. Loneliness is now being treated less as a theme in self-help or moral commentary, and more as a determinant that can shape population well-being at scale. One reason this policy shift became possible is that the epidemiology had grown harder to ignore. Over the last 2 decades, meta-analyses and large reviews have strengthened the case that poor social relationships, social isolation, and loneliness are associated with elevated risks of mortality and morbidity. Public health summaries now routinely mention associations with heart disease, stroke, depression, cognitive decline, and reduced longevity. None of this means loneliness acts like a single pathogen with one clear pathway. The mechanisms remain multiple and overlapping. Stress physiology, sleep disruption, health behavior, cognitive vulnerability, immune and inflammatory pathways, reduced support during illness. But the cumulative picture is strong enough that institutions no longer treat the subject as marginal. Yet the public health turn also carries its own dangers, and a mature science has to resist them. Once loneliness enters policy language, it can begin to sound like a neat, countable crisis with a straightforward solution. But loneliness has never behaved so simply. It is subjective, culturally inflected, developmentally shaped, and intertwined with housing, work, migration, disability, stigma, caregiving burdens, grief, technology, neighborhood design, and the quality, not merely the quantity, of social contact. A person may live in the same city, in the same economic class, even in the same building as another person, and have a radically different experience of belonging. Public health can count prevalence and identify risk, but it cannot fully replace the subtler human question of what makes a life feel shared. This is where the old tension from earlier in the documentary returns in a new form. Is loneliness best understood as a problem of the individual mind, with its attachment history, vigilance patterns, and interpretations? Or is it better understood as a problem of the social world, housing instability, overwork, fragmented communities, digital substitution, economic precarity, weak institutions, collapsing third places, and cultures that prize self-sufficiency while leaving people relationally undernourished. The modern consensus, insofar as there is one, is that the distinction cannot hold cleanly. Loneliness is lived subjectively, but it is patterned socially. It belongs to the nervous system, and it also belongs to the arrangements of daily life that shape whether people regularly encounter trust, continuity, and recognition. That dual nature makes intervention unusually difficult. The evidence suggests that simply increasing the number of social encounters is often not enough, especially when loneliness has become chronic and intertwined with defensive expectations or distrust. At the same time, focusing only on cognition risks pretending that a person can think their way out of a world structurally organized around instability, transience, or thin forms of contact. WHO's 2025 work therefore emphasized action across levels: individuals, communities, services, and policy, while the Surgeon General's advisory also stressed the role of culture, institutions, and public design in supporting connection. The scientific lesson here is not that loneliness has one cure. It is that the problem lives in several layers at once. There is also something historically revealing in the fact that loneliness has become legible as a policy issue only after passing through so many other frames first. It had to be lived before it could be described, culturally named before it could be conceptualized, tied to disconnection before it could be biologically investigated, measured before it could be tracked, and linked to health before institutions felt licensed to take it seriously. That sequence tells us something about modern knowledge itself. Many of the most consequential features of human life remain invisible until several different disciplines, literature, sociology, developmental science, neuroscience, epidemiology, public health, have all, in their own language, pointed to the same hidden thing. And even now, after all of that, uncertainty remains. We still do not fully know how digital life changes loneliness across different personalities and stages of life, or which interventions work best for which forms of disconnection, or how much of modern loneliness is driven by personal history versus social design. We know more than we once did about risk, mechanism, and prevalence, but the field is not finished. It is still trying to understand how subjective pain, early attachment, cultural expectation, and structural conditions meet inside one human life. That unfinished quality is not a weakness. It is part of what makes the topic so revealing. Loneliness sits at the point where science must keep moving back and forth between cells, stories, surveys, and societies. What changes, perhaps, after following the history this far, is the moral atmosphere around the feeling. Loneliness becomes harder to dismiss as oversensitivity, and also harder to romanticize as mere poetic melancholy. It is gentler and harsher than both of those versions. Gentler, because it is ordinary, deeply human, and often rooted in needs no one should be ashamed of having. Harsher, because when it persists, it can wear through sleep, trust, attention, health, and the basic sense that one's life is held among other lives. The science has not erased the mystery of loneliness, but it has made one thing much clearer. The need for secure connection is not sentimental excess. It is one of the conditions under which human beings remain fully themselves. So the story ends where it began, with something quiet, almost invisible, a feeling easy to hide inside an ordinary evening. But it no longer appears small. What seemed at first like a private ache has opened onto a much larger landscape. The architecture of attachment, the organization of social life, the body's response to uncertainty, the politics of public health, the design of communities, the fragile work of being recognized by others. Loneliness lives inside persons. But it also tells the truth about worlds, and perhaps that is why the subject continues to draw science back toward it. In trying to understand why isolation hurts, researchers have been forced, again and again, to ask a more ancient question beneath the modern one. What kind of creature is a human being? If so much of life depends on the presence of other human beings nearby, dependable and real. By the end of this journey, loneliness no longer feels like a small or private subject. It becomes something larger, and in some ways more tender than that. What science slowly uncovered is that loneliness is not simply a passing sadness, nor a personal weakness, nor a failure to be strong enough on your own. It is bound up with the way human beings are made. It touches development, attention, stress, memory, health, and the quiet need to feel that one's life is held in relation to other lives. What once seemed vague or merely emotional turns out to be woven deeply into the human condition. That realization changes more than just the science. It changes the way we see one another. A lonely person is no longer just someone who lacks company. They may be carrying a form of distress that is hard to name, hard to display, and hard for the world to notice. And perhaps that is why this subject lingers in the mind. The science of loneliness is not only about data, theories, or experiments. It is also about recognition. It is about learning that one of the quietest forms of suffering can still leave real marks on a life, and that the need for connection is not childish, excessive, or sentimental. It is part of being human. And even now, the story remains unfinished. There are still questions about how modern life shapes belonging, how technology changes closeness, how children grow into connection, and how entire societies can become more crowded, yet more emotionally distant. Science has taken us far, but not all the way. It has helped us see more clearly what loneliness does, and perhaps why it hurts. But the deeper question remains open, waiting for every generation in its own way. How do human beings stay connected to one another? And what happens when those fragile threads begin to loosen? If you want, I can make it even warmer and more immersive, closer to the emotional accessibility of that high-performing loneliness script, while still keeping it documentary grade